lesson is from Pan-Africanism, the movement of the 60s. Actually, in Africa, it started in the 60s, but I know in the 1780s, there was Pan-Africanism in Britain by two young men who were slaves and who were freed, who were able to buy their freedom in London, and therefore they started a movement of Pan-Africanism among the freed slaves. Pan-Africanism in modern times, we know about the one in the 1960s, championed by Kwame Nkrumah, Tom Mboya, Nyerere, where they were planning for the good of Africans. That is very important that we look at Pan-Africanism, because Africans are a community of people. We are of diverse culture, but we have commonalities. Not just the ones which are invisible, or that are visible, that we are all black, but we have a commonality in that we also have a common enemy. One of our enemies that is becoming very in the past, our enemies were colonialism and slavery. Things from the outside, invader from the outside, coming and being facilitated by chiefs in Africa. Today, we have invaders from inside Africa. We have corrupt leaders. We have civil strife. We have hunger, poverty, crisis after crisis. The enemy we are having, the challenges we are having within Africa, many of them are challenges we can manage. They are challenges within our grasp, but we haven't sat to strategize about them. We're just allowing ourselves to be used as pawns. And I will mention the manageable ones first. In traditional Africa, we had indigenous knowledge about disaster management. Because of how big Africa is, it has different climatic zones. We had cycles of drought. We have them recorded in history. We had cycles of drought. We had cycles of drought where you couldn't grow crops. So we had drought-resistant crops like cassava, which you have to eat just a little. We even ate cassava leaves, yeah? So when the cassava grows, you eat the root, but we even have roots in the arid areas, yeah, that are now being used to develop, are being used by pharmaceuticals to develop a weight loss program so people eat less, yeah? We have those things and we have the knowledge about it. We also had ways of preserving food. So that was very important. Luos also had a way of sorting out conflicts. We were a homogeneous society. People lived in clans. We have sister clans. We have clans where families are linked by marriage. So you knew not to, whenever someone wanted to marry, they would always try to find out, where did your grandmother come from? And where did her grandmother, and whose son? And so that people knew not to marry among kinsmen. We knew that long before we knew about genetics. And that is very important because sometimes our indigenous knowledge was thought about to be too simplistic, that it could not have made sense. Well, it did make sense for our ancestors and it kept us going. And another thing that kept us going for a long time in the area of herbal medicine was the fact that we preserved, we didn't just go deforestating. We cooked with firewood, but we also cooked with maize cobs. So our sources of fuel were very, very respectful of the environment. And I'll elaborate what I mean. When you wanted, our food, shelter, and clothing depended on materials available locally. When it came to our food, we grew what suited our soil. We also grew what we will eat and what we'll preserve. But when, for example, we needed to thatch our roofs, we used grass from the local environment. When we needed to weave the granary, we use reeds from the local environment. When we needed to replenish the mud, replaster the hut, the soil was got from the local environment. So our shelter, materials for our shelter came from the local environment. The trees came from the local environment. When we had, our clothing was from bark, was from sisal, materials available in the local environment. Our village ecology was very clear. Our village ecology was very simple. We didn't have to fly things from different parts of the world. And that's why when the early traders came with white cloth, it was a big surprise. People had not seen that. When they brought ram and gave it to the chief, that was not been seen before. And when they brought guns, the main change, which changed the whole dynamics between conflict resolution in Africa, and which up to date, I mean, we hear of blood diamonds, we hear about people paying with guns for resources. We see the wars of resources. We see the wars being caused by people giving guns being in the wrong hands. We were wary of that. We didn't solve conflict. We solved our conflicts through restorative justice initially. And things were escalated, but decisions were taken at every time, and there was sanctity of life and maintaining human dignity, very important principles. So I think that it's very important for us to revisit some of those useful lessons we had in Luo indigenous culture, because as the Luos were moving those 1,000 years from southern Sudan to Lake Victoria where we are, it's not that there were no conflicts, it's not that there was no disaster, it's not that there were no epidemics, but the community came together. They rallied around and they thought, what can we do, not for my betterment, but for the betterment for the community? How do I ensure that the clan survives? How do I ensure that we are not obliterated? And that's why we need to go back to that kind of thinking. Now we no longer live in our traditional communities, but we have Africans in the diaspora and Africans back home in Africa. Thank God for Africans in the diaspora, because the dangers and the mechanisms that have been used to try and finish the Luos cannot finish all of us everywhere where we are. We are getting new ideas. You come out here and you rethink, what best can I do for home? And we are very interested in home. Africanus.